Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is Dan, and you're listening to the Having Initiative podcast. Today's episode is entitled Justice. Now, this is a big topic, and I debated splitting this into 2 episodes, but I found that there is a linear progression that you need to hear kind of in one fell swoop, so it had to be one in order to understand the full context of everything. So, justice. This word is being thrown around a lot, and I want to stress that it is something that is very important, don't get me wrong, but I'm hearing it being thrown around in so many different contexts. Like as people speak, the words that come before and after it, the paragraphs in which it is used, and the kind of situations that it's applied with, it's being used in so many different contexts that it seems like we're not necessarily all after the same thing. And so, like a lot of words that I've found that being the case, I mean, now that I think about it, most of my podcast has been clarifying terms or at least giving my opinions on them. So, justice is important, but I've also seen it used to justify some not great things. So, before I get into the chapters, I got a couple of stories to go over. So I saw on YouTube someone uploaded this kind of local evening news report. Maybe it wasn't the evening. Local news report of a father who caught a family friend molesting his son, who was, I think, maybe like 10 at the youngest. You know, he was a teenager, very young. And in that news story, you hear the news story. The father beats the living daylights out of the at that time alleged molester. This was confirmed, so I'm not going to say that anymore. And they show before and after of the guy who was beaten up, and then the before picture, and then the mug shot. And he is unrecognizable. This father just went to town on this guy. And they share audio of the 911 call. And the father was furious on there. And he's saying, it's a terrible situation, but some of the things that he says are really funny. And like, he's like, I've got him in a bloody puddle for you, officer. And the dispatcher says, were any weapons involved? And he's like, my fist and my foot. And you should check out the YouTube comments on that. But the bottom line is, with the comments on there, so many people, I mean, I don't think there's anyone that is defending the molester. Everyone is saying, like, the father was right, or not necessarily right, but what he did was justified in some way. The guy deserved what he got. That's the bottom line. Because I don't know, well, for the most part, I don't know anyone who would smile upon molestation in our society. It's not something that is, condoned. And so the father, seeing that happening, took action against that. And most people would say that was justified. Now, I don't want to date these podcasts too much, but for this case, I will. I'm recording this shortly after the 2022 Oscars, where one individual slapped another individual for speaking ill of his wife. Now, there are some in that situation who say, as a man, a husband, he was standing up for his wife's honor or something along those lines. And so what he did was justified. And then a lot of other people saying, no matter how foul the joke was, violence is never acceptable. Let me repeat that. Violence is never acceptable a response. Now, I wonder if the people who are saying violence is never acceptable, if we played that YouTube video of the report of the child molestation, if they would say that, if they would agree. So, but both of these cases, people are arguing something is justified or unjustified. And while, I mean, you could try and stay like with the first case, everyone agrees that molestation is an awful thing. Therefore, people who do that awful thing should be punished. And it's not so much that punishment is the quote unquote logical conclusion. It's just the one that most people seem to naturally reach because, again, that is such a heinous crime. But at the same time, a lot of people, honor and standing up for women, they will say that that is something that it needs to be either encouraged or become the norm. And so they, in the case of the Oscars, they were saying that slap was justified. So that story is, a little contrast. I got one more. I don't know if y'all have seen the movie Batman Begins, but it's a great movie, first of all. But there's many interpretations of how Bruce Wayne's parents get murdered. In this one, Bruce Wayne, as a kid, his parents were murdered by just a homeless guy trying to steal some money and pearls. And then his name was Joe Chill. He gets caught nearly immediately and thrown in jail. And then years later, maybe like a decade or something or more, Bruce is coming back to town for a parole hearing because that guy, Joe Chill, was in jail with a crime lord, and he's willing to testify to help lock up the crime lord if he gets early release. And Bruce is having none of that. Well, long story short, it looks like he's going to get off, but Bruce came to that court hearing ready to shoot him, the guy, when he's in public because he doesn't think that he wants revenge, or rather, he wants justice for his parents' murder. But someone that works for the crime lord kills the informant before he can, so he's a little bummed about that. And on the car ride home, he's talking with his friend who works in the DA's office who helped to orchestrate the early release of the man who killed his parents. And Bruce says, maybe I should thank the person that killed the man that killed my parents. And his friend says, you don't mean that. And he says, maybe I do, because my parents deserve justice. Again, that word, justice. And she says, you're not talking about justice. You're talking about revenge. And he responds, well, sometimes they're the same thing. Justice, something bad happens. The person who did it gets what they deserve. And vengeance, something bad happened to me, and I get to take action against the person who did it so that the scales are balanced. She responds that justice and vengeance are never the same thing because justice is about harmony, whereas revenge is about making yourself feel better. And that's something right there, feel better, that I think ties into the first two stories that I told you, because when I look around and hear the context and of what people are saying about justice and how they react, so much, I believe, of what we deem as justice or, I guess balance in a way is emotionally motivated. And and I'm going to go into this in a bit, but there's good reasons for that. So I'm going to start exploring that. The chapters for this episode are feelings, laws, and intentions, by the letter versus variability, and feelings part 2. So quick warning for this episode. You may not like some of what I have to say here. You may think I'm an awful person, or I don't appreciate the problems at hand, or because I don't agree with your emotional state that I'm a monster, or something like that. My advice for you is, first of all, listen to everything I have to say in this episode. Also, my views on whatever I mention here are very complicated. If you haven't guessed by listening to the podcast, I give things a lot of thought and I try to be fair to everyone. My views are very complicated and they are far more extensive than I can go into on this podcast. And there are some censorship rules that I have to watch out for with the platforms that this will be loaded onto. So that kind of limits some of the things I can say. So please just hear me out. I'm a nice guy when you get to know me. All right, let's go. So feelings. First of all, recount that Batman Begins story that I mentioned about how justice or vengeance is about making yourself feel better, whereas justice is some sort of greater balance, whether it's, karmic or and more, intimate. Now, again, as I said, a lot of people, their sense of justice comes from their feelings, and not just like with crimes, but like in their day-to-day lives, something doesn't feel right or wrong, or they can say, you know, I should do this. Maybe society tells me that, or maybe, my own moral code. But in the immediacy of this situation, this action feels wrong that would otherwise be considered right, or this action feels right that would otherwise be considered wrong. And when we argue about justice, some people think feelings are what we should go off of, or passion is another word that's used in, substitution for it. And others say that we should be logical and reasonable about things. Now, I think I mentioned this in season 1, but I'm going to say it here. I have a podcast plan where I talk about this, but logic and reason are influenced on some level by emotion or our experience or our temperament. One or all of these. These all have a factor in what we will conclude is logical or reasonable. So and a quick side note on this, a lot of people who argue for logic and reason as the way forward will often quote someone like Spock, because that is the personification of what they deemed is ideal in terms of not falling. The people that do this, they love their emotions. They just don't like superstition. And so the logic seems to be the counterbalance to finding reason in the absence of superstition or the metaphysical, that kind of thing. But remember that Spock is a character on a TV show written and performed by humans. So he's not real. He's not the embodiment of logic in a living form. So sorry about that side note. I'm getting back to it. So there's an Aristotle quote that I want to mention about law and justice, I guess you could say. The law is reason unaffected by desire. I looked that up online. And when I watched Legally Blonde, it said the law is reason free of passion. So take your pick on which definition to use. So we can try to be dispassionate about the law, but there's always going to be a little bit of that. And when we're talking about a specific situation, the instinct, I guess, is to say, if you want to be consistent with the law, again, this is being dispassionate, forget all of the extraneous factors about the individuals and just look at the flat facts of the situation, and that's how you should judge things. But remember, the law, even though if ideally we're trying to go in an emotionless state, it was written by humans, and a lot of the motivation for laws was to address something bad, typically speaking, or that someone thought was bad. And so there's the idea that we should detach emotion from the sense of the law or the sense of justice in the bigger sense. But without passion, we would have no concept of justice. As I mentioned, that everything that's logical and reasonable is at the mercy of what's going on inside of us, and that's our emotions, experiences, and temperament, that kind of thing. But I was talking to a therapist once, and we were talking about emotions and their kind of purpose, I guess you could say. And we were talking about anger, I guess, outrage by the same measure. And their view was that anger is our response to injustice. Something awful is happening. So we get angry and we get more tunnel vision and we get that kind of angry strength to go along with it. And that is all to address the injustice that is before us. Because if we never got upset by anything, then terrible things would just happen and we would walk on by, and it's not self-destructive, but I mean, we will fall apart if we can't ever fight back against something that is either a threat to us personally or a threat to something greater than us. And that tends to be where our passions come from. So passion has its place. I want that to be very clear. The problem that I see is that the counterpoint is that people seem to think, a lot of people rather, seem to think that passion is the only thing that matters when we're talking about justice or what is right or balance in a way, when a wrong is committed. So there's, I guess, two extremes. Passion is what's most important, and anything that I feel, going back to the vengeance case, is justice. I see that happening a lot. And then there's the counterpoint of, okay, completely detaching from the situation, nothing will really get solved that way because we will be dispassionate and not feel anything, and then terrible things will keep on happening. So, since I talked about how I think too many people are taking too much liberty with passion and justifying terrible things as a result of it, there is this notion of, most people would agree, of righteous anger. Like I said, with emotions, there are things that, yeah, you should be upset about. Those are atrocities, that kind of thing. Just like with molestation, there are other crimes where most people will agree that is wrong. And I don't want to go into the particulars, but a lot of people would argue that that is so wrong, it warrants death or warrants life and imprisonment. And then there's something, a quick caveat. I've heard people say that violence is never the solution, but when the same people who say that get word of some sexual crimes, they say that that person should be given the most violent, vicious, awful punishment there is. And they say it's justified because that sexual crime is so wrong. So sorry about that tangent, but most people agree that perpetrators, particularly of awful things, should be punished. Now, for some crimes that people can acknowledge are bad, but not the uber far end like the ones I just mentioned, some people say that they should be rehabilitated. But that far end of the awful, awful things, most people will agree that there should be punishment for that. And that's all of this is interesting, to say the least. Now, as I said, passion has its place. I think with the course of this podcast and in general, my thought is that we're going a little too far in the passionate direction, and that emotion is a dangerous precedent for justice. Like, think about Batman Begins. Like, I deserved vengeance, and it's that he was trying to make himself feel better about something awful. And what happened to him was awful, but he was using that as something awful happened to him, and he was using that as justification to do something awful. And there's a villain later on in the movie that says justice is balance. It's in contrast to what his friend said about justice is harmony, which some would argue a balance has been achieved in harmony. There's kind of certain synonym applications with those words. But the villain in the movie says justice is balance, and that's kind of what Bruce was doing in the beginning. He did something awful to me, I do something awful to him, justice. But no, it was vengeance. So that's a little bit of what I wanted to go into about emotion now. So with justice, a lot of ways that this comes to be is through laws. And not all laws are good, and some laws that some would argue had good intentions can have bad results. So I'm going to talk about laws and intentions with them. This might be the potentially most controversial part of this podcast, so just bear with me. So whether this is the situation right now or this is just my ideal, here's something that I believe is useful for examining laws and their potential disparities as a result of them. So there's an idea that something is bad is happening and we should stop it. So idea. Then what comes next is, okay, let's make a law that should fix that or address it or mitigate it. So ideas ideas spawn laws. Okay, now a law written down on some document somewhere, that alone doesn't do anything. We have to enforce the law some way, somehow. So an idea spawns a law, and the law has to be enforced. Now, as that is being enforced that will have a certain effect on what's going on. So ideas spawn laws that need to be enforced that have effects on individuals, society, and whatnot. So hopefully the idea were inspired by something that was truly bad, and that when the laws were written, it truly addresses that bad issue, and as it is enforced, it truly solves that issue, and the effect is that everything gets better, or some things get better. That issue does. Now, the idea that it's supposed to address, hopefully most or all people saw that as something that needed to be addressed, because there's always going to be nuance when we're talking about morality and what is right and wrong, and so there's always going to be some dissent for the most part. Because even earlier I talked about how everyone agrees molestation is bad. There's some people that unfortunately are trying to, well, yes, but the molestation issue. Now, I want to kind of give an example of what I just talked about, how ideas, laws, enforcement, and affect that kind of through line. So let's do a hypothetical situation to where it's already on the books that murder is wrong. Killing someone is wrong. You shouldn't do it. That's in the books. If you kill someone, you're going to jail, something like that. And the effect is that certain more violent areas, people tend to get locked up a lot more since they are killing people at higher rates. That's going to happen. But in the course of implementing this, there are situations where someone is being violently attacked and they either defend themselves and the perpetrator is killed in the process, or they don't defend themselves and they just die. Now, in the case that they just die, dead men tell no tales. But in the case where they defend themselves, technically, per the law, they killed someone. And so if you're going with a literal interpretation of that law about how killing is wrong, the person who was attacked, who defended themselves, is now going to jail. Now, most people, when they see that, they would argue that that person was innocent, they weren't doing anything, and they just tried to survive. And the result was that the perpetrator got killed. And some people will go further and say that, okay, as soon as the perpetrator attacked the innocent person, they lost the right to be defended by the law that said killing is wrong. So bottom line, people make enough of us that say, okay, people shouldn't A, be punished for defending themselves in a life-threatening situation, or B, people shouldn't just roll over and die in a life-threatening situation. And there were some talks about, okay, people reasonably tried to run away, they got cornered, and then they got beat up, or they fought the perpetrator. So to do this, we have the idea of, okay, in a life-threatening situation, people should be able to defend themselves. So that's the idea, that if you're attacked, you should be able to defend yourself. So we make a law that says, in the course of a violent assault, and the particulars aren't important, the bottom line is if your life is in danger, you have the right to defend yourself. So then with law enforcement or enforcing the law, not necessarily law enforcement, as these cases come to trial, we pick up the mess of these situations. We get a variety of effects as a result of that. There are some cases where, as far as we can tell, the person didn't, do anything to get themselves in this fight. It was brought on upon them. They tried to de-escalate or whatever. They tried to run away, but nothing happened, and the skirmish occurred, and the perpetrator died. That's one effect that happens. Now, another effect that would potentially happen with that is that people would use that precedent, I have a right to defend myself, as, okay, if I think I am going to be in danger, I can take preemptive action to not be in danger, and they, attack the perpetrator. Or they're attacked, they overpower the perpetrator, and then they torture them in the name of self-defense. Now, with this case, the idea that you should be able to defend yourself, again, most would say that's a good idea, but how this has turned out is that there are a lot more specific circumstances that are coming out as a result of this, or people are trying to justify certain awful actions in the framework of this new law. So I would say with this case, then they would probably go, okay, so we agree that people shouldn't have to just roll over and die. But at the same time, this is being abused as an attempt to basically commit premeditated murder. So we should probably give nuance. And some examples of that in the real world that are on law is that, okay, you have to try to run away, something like that, or you have to have no other alternatives and stuff like that. And as you listen to the story, I hope you don't get caught up on trying to solve this particular issue based off of what I'm saying here. I hope you're getting that there was a situation that we tried to address through law, and as we enforced it, it may or may not have had the effect that we desired. Sometimes it had another negative effect that came out of nowhere, or it just straight up didn't solve the original problem. Now, another example of that I want to kind of use to illustrate the my views on an idea spawns a law that needs to be enforced that then has an effect are drug laws. Now, some people argue that drug laws were made because drugs are bad and can devastate people's lives and destroy communities, all of which there is extensive evidence and examples of this happening. And others claim that drug laws were created to target and incarcerate certain minorities because they use those drugs at higher rates. Now, with that example, there's people for and against these drug laws, but there are some people that are also that think drugs are awful and that they devastate communities, but are in favor of removing some of those laws. And they have an argument that they also share with people that say that drug laws were created to incarcerate certain demographics, which is that their argument is that the laws for stopping drug use haven't worked. They had an idea, they made a law, and they enforced it, and as a result, people are still doing drugs, and instead some are just getting locked up for a long time. Or they're saying, they increase the severity of the punishment for the laws, and as a result, a kid experiments and then gets years in prison, and their whole life is now thrown into the crapper as a result of that one itty-bitty instance when they were younger. So I hope, again, whatever your views on drug laws are, that illustrates the idea that it is possible that a law was made to fix a problem, but created another or just failed to solve the particular one. So now, still in the frame of mind of laws and intentions, a term that gets thrown up a lot is systemic injustice or discrimination, something along those lines. Now, I ask people to show me the specifics of what they believe systemic injustice is, and typically they will make speculation about the idea, or they will say that a law was inspired by a bad idea, but it's hard to prove, well, for the most part, the motivations of certain laws. And some will argue that enforcement is disproportionate in the implementation of a law, or they will say that the effects create a disparity in the outcome, therefore it was the idea or the law behind it was inherently unjust. Now, the biggest one where people point are the disproportionate results of certain laws. That's the one that has the most criticism. I've heard very few arguments that, because, I mean, most of the time when people are passing laws, like legislators, they, at least these days, aren't so open about malevolent intent. And so again, I said that people tend to point to the results. It's hard to be certain about the intentions. And definitely, yes, there are some policies that we can trace that the person who advocated for them had some bad ideas in mind. But most of the time, I've found in my exploration with people that they see disparate results, and therefore they think that somewhere up the chain, the idea, the law itself, or the enforcement are intentionally going after disparate results, for lack of a better term. Now, I'm not saying systemic injustice isn't a thing. I'm saying the people that argue for its existence a lot of them are seeing results and being very emotional about it, and they're clawing at anything. And systemic injustice is the term that they use to give voice to their despair. Now, as I said, I'm not saying systemic injustice is not a thing. If there is a bad idea that was floating around that then became a law, I want that changed. If there was a law that is written that explicitly targets certain demographics in certain ways than others, I want that gone. If we can get proof that enforcement is intentionally selective in how we address that, implement a certain law, I want that addressed. If results are disproportionate, I want to know why. And I want to know if the original idea is being served, or if the original idea was awful and we shouldn't serve it, or if we just need to fix various other things along the way. Now, again, just because there is disparity in the results does not always mean that it had bad intent from the beginning. Just like that self-defense explanation I gave earlier, there was a good motivation for making that hypothetical law if you are allowed to defend yourself. So I hope that I haven't offended you, and hopefully you got what I was trying to get at there. So if you made it this far, thank you for listening, but we got some more to go. So with laws or justice, attempts to codify justice into a legal framework so that we can all see it and all be held to that standard, which generally speaking is something that people desire. We have to talk about, with laws, let's say it's a perfect law. At least it had good intentions at the very least. So when we interpret that law, do we go by the letter, or do we allow a certain level of variability in terms of implementing it? So equality is something that most people want, but very few can actually define, I've found. But inequality is understandably frustrating. And when we're talking about justice here, one thing that I see a lot is that people compare outcomes of seemingly the same crime and then getting different sentencing or that kind of thing. But oftentimes, this is really frustrating to see, but some people will compare two people, generally speaking these days, of different races or national backgrounds. They'll compare two instances of them apparently committing the same crime and getting different sentences. But if you look a little deeper, you'll find that these are in different locations, therefore under different potential statutes or whatnot. They were judged by different judges and juries, and therefore will have, different interpretations of what's going on. And there are different particulars at times. Sometimes if you break it down to bare minimum, yes, person A attacked person B, that's the same. But there's more argumentation about provocation or mental state sometimes. Or person A who attacked person B had a much longer criminal record, or this happened in school zone, certain things like that. And then sometimes, even better, these two cases that people are comparing occurred decades apart. So there's lots of, in those examples, there's lots of different reasons why different outcomes could come. And yes, sometimes it is one person who committed the crime got a judge who didn't like them and sentenced them to some hard time, whereas the other judge was feeling generous. So when we talk about equality, if we want, that situation that I talked about, getting two different judges and different outcomes, yeah, that will cause unequal results. There will be disparity in outcomes. And if we want the idea of equality, then we want more or less equal outcomes for the equal crimes committed. So that brings me to two stories that I want to address right here. I'm going to have to pick my words carefully because I know YouTube has some words about certain words being used, so bear with me. Brock Turner was a guy who was in college, and I can't say the word on YouTube, but he performed unconsensual sex upon another college girl. And I'm not afraid to say the word, people. I'm not allowed to say it because this is going on YouTube eventually. So I'm sorry. But anyway, he was arrested, and this was proven. He admitted it, I believe, in court. It was proved beyond a reasonable doubt that this occurred. There were witnesses. No, well, I mean, 99.9999% of the population agrees this happened. There is no question about it. He should be punished. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the judge acknowledged that he did the deed, and the minimum sentencing was like 2 years in prison, which I'm shocked that it's that low. But the judge believed that locking him up for this crime at this point in his life would ruin any potential that he had. I think he had like a promising future. That was the vernacular that was used. So as a result of that, the judge didn't want to send him to jail. So he gave him, or maybe he gave him like a month in jail or something like that, and probation for the rest of it. And again, this was a crime where everyone agreed that the terrible deed had happened. So understandably, people were very upset when this was brought to the public light. And people gave lots of different reasons for why that happened, but most people would attribute it to one particular reason why that, Mr. Turner got off. And some said it was his race, some said it was his that he was a man, some said that it was because he was rich, some said it was because the judge was an asshole. Everyone gave, usually boiled it down to one reason. Now, that's awful. I want to make that clear. As a result of this situation, a lot of people were saying, okay, there was a minimum sentence for that, and the judge absolved them of even that. So how about if there is a minimum sentence for a crime, no matter who you are or what you did, if you are convicted, proven, then you will get the minimum sentencing at the very least. Again, most people believe that he deserved a lot more, which I do. And so they were saying, okay, well, if we can't get the most, then at the very least, it was codified in law that he should get this minimum punishment. He should get that minimum punishment at least. So everyone after hearing, or not everyone, but most people after hearing that story say, yes, you should get the minimum sentencing. So story number 2. I heard this story off of a YouTube video with the personality who I have no reason to doubt his integrity on this, but I've tried to find that episode. I can't, so I can't confirm. I can't, get like the news story or whatnot that this happened, but take it faith on me that this really did happen and that I'm not creating a story for the purpose of illustrating a point. So the story that I heard was that a 16-year-old boy, something around that time, committed a crime like breaking and entering or some kind of hefty theft while people were around. And that caused a lot of distress. But the guy didn't physically harm anyone or something like that. And the people who were the victims of this, while they were upset by what happened, they weren't feeling particularly vengeful. Now, in the area where this occurred, the minimum sentencing for this was like several years. Now, I forget if it was the judge or the DA, one of those two big entities involved in deciding how much they should punish this young man for this crime. One of the guys said, yes, we acknowledge that this was bad and he shouldn't have done it, and we will, some kind of punishment, probation, community service, something like that. But if we send him to jail now for he's 16, if we send him to jail for several years, that's going to ruin his life. I mean, he may be able to recover from this, but it is going to be a wallop on him. And so we understand that what he did was wrong. He shouldn't have done it, and we do think he should be punished. But we don't think that minimum sentence of several years in prison should be applied to this case. Now, that was one of I don't know if it was the judge or the DA that said this, but the opposite party, the DA or the judge, said, I understand the arguments you're making, but the law says we have the minimum sentence for this crime, which we have proven beyond a reasonable doubt is several years in prison. I don't like it, but for the sake of being consistent and fair under the law, we have to give him the minimum sentencing. So again, 2 stories, one where everyone agrees at least the minimum sentencing should have been applied, and then another story where most people who hear that story believe that an exception should have been made for that young man, and he shouldn't have been. Even the people who were involved in sentencing him said, we shouldn't give him the minimum punishment for this because that will be a negative effect on him. But that was the same argument that was used with Mr. Turner. So when I present people with these kind of things, most people, regardless of the particulars, will give out this vague statement of saying, we should, if we believe in punishment or, rehabilitation or whatnot, whoever commits a crime or something, does something bad that we all agree is bad, they should get a fair sentence. Problem is that we're never going to agree on what's fair for crimes. There's always going to be various disagreement. And that brings me to my next point when we're talking about variability, is that there is no perfect system. So everyone says we should be treated fairly and we should be treated equally. But if we go with the result of that first story, and everyone should get at least the minimum sentencing, there will be times where certain individuals are feeling a little soft on certain issues, and so they will lean towards the minimum sentencing, and then other individuals will get that same situation placed in front of them, and they'll be hard on it, and they'll start going for the maximum. So even if you are acting fairly, and assuming all cases that are brought before are proved beyond a reasonable doubt that this actually happened and that punishment should be administered, if you allow that framework of a range of punishment, there will be disparate results. And the second story, this holds even more so, that if you allow discretion in sentencing, being able to operate outside of that minimum maximum framework, you will definitely get variable results and disparity in your outcome, inequality. So that brings me to, there is no perfect way in terms of codifying laws. And even if we could make perfect laws that are, objective and fair, we all agree on their fairness, they have to be implemented by people. And there's a lot of people in different places committing a lot of different crimes and being judged by a lot of different juries and being sentenced by a lot of different judges. So there's always going to be something that you see as a result of a trial that makes you angry because justice was not served. So, and if we hold everyone to the same standard, a lot of people won't agree on that standard, and so they will be upset about its implementation. I believe it was in my previous podcast, I talked about how if 100 people are asked what's the best color, and 30% of them say red, they're the largest percentage, and every other color gets less than 30%. Apply that framework to sentencing people for crimes. So that means 30% of people will think that is a just punishment. 70% of people will think it's unjust, but that 70% of people, they don't all agree on one punishment or outcome. They all disagree with each other on what it should be. So no one's going to be completely happy except that 30%, if that's what we decide to go by. So kind of wrapping up this point about disparity, when comparing different cases and different locations that occurred in different times, be careful. There are a lot of court cases that come out publicly that I get very upset by the outcomes that happen there. But I do try and keep my head on straight about going too far and saying everything is awful because this one case or these 10 cases didn't go the way that I wanted them to. So be careful when comparing different, cases in different locations at different times. It's definitely possible there are people that are prejudiced. History has shown us this. But remember, episode 2, take inventory of what we know, acknowledge what we don't know, therefore discern between projection and what's in front of us, figure out what we can know, and accept what we can't know. So, since it was so good the first time, that brings us to feelings, part 2. So we've talked a lot about laws, and there's this, when people agree with laws, they say, you should follow the law. And when people don't agree with laws, they say the law is unjust and we shouldn't have to do it. So there's a lot of good people that I know that are of the mindset of, um, I follow the rules unless those rules are stupid. Now, that sounds great, but again, different interpretations and different opinions on what is right and wrong. If everyone thinks like that, we're going to be at each other's throats all the time. And to recap when I'm talking about feelings, what a person finds to be a logical or reasonable outcome will be influenced by their emotions and their temperament and other stuff, whatever is going on inside of them. And I want to talk about an example that shines a light on people's biases. And it's basically judging the validity of certain people's actions in a crime based off of the race of the people involved. So here's an example. Person A is minding their own business. Person B holds them up with like a knife or a gun. Person A punches, kicks, or shoots person B. Kind of like that molestation case, but this is a little different. And people see this and they're like, yes, person A stood up for themselves. There's a lot of videos on YouTube where a young mother is being attacked and she fights off the perpetrator or kills the perpetrator. And most people say, you go, girl. That's power right there. Everyone thinks that that was justified. She was defending her young. Now, there are times when I've seen people see that situation, agree with the outcome, and then a week or more, the same situation occurs, but the race of the perpetrator or the victim are different, and that person doesn't have the same judgment of what is more or less the same situation. Now, I acknowledge there are differences, but often with the ones that I'm talking about, the cases are almost identical. But what was different was the race or the sexual orientation or the political alignment of the individuals involved. Now, all of a sudden, person A isn't justified. They should have run away or they should have talked down the person that's attacking them. They didn't need to respond that way, and now someone is dead. And the response is, what should they have done? Or the question is, what should they have done? And the person who's judging, condemning the person that they otherwise would have praised in a different light, they say, I don't know, they just shouldn't have killed the person that was trying to hurt them or hurt their child. And so what I was talking, this situation about how people have the same situation but different, agreeing with the outcome depending on if it's the person that they agreeing with the outcome if the demographics of the people involved are different. That's something I've seen applied in a lot of different situations when we're talking about justice, oftentimes by the same people who are advocating for equality in outcomes. It's just something to think about. So that it's all complicated, people. Feelings are complicated, and we can't divorce them from our sense of justice or our laws, but if we let them rule us, that is also a bad thing. So I was going to talk with justice. I was going to talk about punishment versus rehabilitation, prison sentencing. But honestly, it's a lot of what I was talking about here, which is that people have opinions on what it should be, and no one's ever going to agree. The key thing to take away is that there's the nature of the problem, and then there's the solution, and we're going to have issues agreeing on both. So to wrap things up, if you've made it this far, I appreciate it. As I was typing them up, I was typing the outline for this up, I was worried about how some of these ideas were going to be interpreted. So if you've made it this far, I do appreciate that much, even if you don't agree, for hearing me out. Some of my closing thoughts is that I don't think that justice, regardless of what our motivations are about it, whether it's in law or personal issues, I don't think justice can be based solely off of what makes us feel better, because there needs to be more nuance to it than that. And I do acknowledge that there is an emotional component, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But I doubt that many individuals can write down their views on justice. First of all, articulate them well, and that those views are, consistent and not contradictory in some way, and then that people can act consistently within that. I doubt that there's anyone that can do it. So have your convictions, but please do make an effort, because we're all talking about how people need to be getting educated. Talk to someone that you disagree with. And uh, there's an expression I mentioned earlier: if you seek to understand, you'll never be offended. I find that doesn't always hold up, but it's a good place to start. So have your convictions, but be patient with other people. You know, everyone is a hypocrite sooner or later, and that includes you. So thanks everybody for listening. And now it's time for a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you again for listening. This was an episode that, when I wrote it, I pushed myself to talk about things that I believed weren't being discussed, but could also be inflammatory. And there was the temptation to censor. And honestly, I mean, I didn't go too controversial, I don't think. But there were a couple of things that I knew might rub some people the wrong way. But so far, the response has been good for this episode. And by that, I mean, whenever I ask people, what did you think? They say interesting points were raised. Both sides were presented well. And if people like something, I'd ask them to say why. And they would usually tell me something, and I would learn something in the process. They had something I didn't know. So if you agreed with what I said, let me know in the comments here. And if not, let me know why, because I want to learn. Thank you again for listening. If you want to support the channel, please like, comment, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and share this video with your friends and family. So thanks again, people. Take care.